What do Rain World, Source movement game modes, and obscure arena shooters all have in common? Well, there's a lot of answers to this question. These types of games have incredibly high skill ceilings, and they reward you a tremendous amount for experimentation. They're often simple on the surface with a lot of complexities hidden underneath. But this is not the similarity they have that interests me the most. The thing that fascinates me the most about these games is that they're completely and utterly doomed. They are destined to be unpopular, destined to sit at the bottom of the Steam player base charts. But it's not because they aren't good games, far from it. Don't believe me? Then let me quickly show you why. This game is called Hyperdemon. It's a sort of sequel to the game Devil Daggers, both of which are unusual takes on an arena survival shooter. I was a massive fan of Devil Daggers. I think Devil Daggers is a fantastic game, so when I heard that there was a sequel to this game, I just had to know more about it. But despite Hyperdemon being a sequel, the only thing that these two games truly have in common is their hilariously cliche names. Devil Daggers is a very simplistic game. A game where the only goal is to survive for as long as humanly possible. The core concept, as well as the mechanics of the game itself, are incredibly simple. And what makes the game interesting is how these simple concepts are used to make a very challenging and strategically rich experience. Hyperdemon has done away with all this simplicity. Everything is more complex. Literally everything. There's now a dash and a ground slam, and there's a bunch of new enemies that all require certain methods of killing. There's a laser attack that does different things depending on what you shoot with it. Even the timer, which you'd think would be taken for granted, is completely different. Instead of ticking upwards forever, where the longer your timer goes, the higher your score, instead, the timer ticks downwards. Your time constantly trickles away down to 0, and killing things adds to your timer. The high score still works the same. The bigger this number, the higher your score. But the way you actually gain this score is completely different. And for me, a big part of the charm of Devil Daggers in the first place was this simplicity. It was so easy to understand, yet it managed to be incredibly challenging in spite of that. There was no crazy complex mechanics or anything. It was just your 2 mouse buttons and this arena full of skulls. And Hyperdemon has mostly done away with that. These two games, despite being related to each other, are very, very different from one another. And there's no doubt about it. But the thing that these two games do share, and the thing that I think curses them to remain in their obscurity, is their incredibly difficult learning curve. Despite the game being pretty fun and well designed for the most part, the new player experience is completely terrible. You see, this footage is from the current world record holder in Hyperdemon, a 4:03.6 time on the leaderboard. It looks pretty crazy, right? Well, that's because it is crazy, and the trailer is no different. It makes the game look incredibly fun and fast-paced. But instead of watching that footage, let's quickly take a look at my footage. This is the real Hyperdemon experience. This is what 99% of players are experiencing when they download this game. In fact, my gameplay is actually above average by quite a lot, despite how bad I am at this game, and despite how slow I look. There are currently just over 24,000 times on the leaderboard. There are a lot of times here. There are very many people to scroll past on this leaderboard before you get to the very top. But the middle of the road score, at around 12,000 players on the leaderboard, is just 17 seconds. 17 seconds is not a good time, and the same thing could also be seen in Devil Daggers. There are almost 300,000 players on the Devil Daggers leaderboard, and the middle of the road time, around 150,000, is about 74 seconds, which is a pretty terrible time. These games, despite being very good, are cursed by their barrier to entry. Despite being very simple, Devil Daggers is not only very difficult, but it also doesn't hold your hand, like not even slightly. The game doesn't tell you anything. You're just forced to either figure it out for yourself or Google it. How the enemies work, how they behave, and what the hell gems do. None of that is explained. Hyperdemon is more complex, so the game actually does have a tutorial baked into the client, but this tutorial only really gives you the basics. Understanding how to effectively kill enemies and clear the stage quickly is a whole other ballgame, and the game has basically no desire to explain it to you. And part of the fun of the game is figuring it out for yourself. But if you're a new player, sometimes that's not what you want. Sometimes you want to be able to actually look at a trailer, see the gameplay and then actually do that yourself when you play the game. And funnily enough, community-created game modes suffer with this exact problem a ton. Things like surfing in Counter-Strike or jump maps in TF2. These game modes are entirely 100% community-created and community-managed. The maps and servers you play on are created not by a team of paid developers, but instead by groups of dedicated community members working for completely free. And this of course leads to the exact same problem. Tutorials are few and far between, only being made by extremely dedicated community members who put the time and effort into making them. And they're all third party. They can only be found on YouTube. None of them are actually baked into the game, because the game isn't about surfing or jumping. It's about shooting enemy players. And even then, these tutorials are not comprehensive by any means, because things like surf and jump are incredibly complicated game modes, so talking about all of it in a concise tutorial is practically impossible to begin with. Not to mention that these game modes are based off of unintentional mechanics in the game's engine, which makes them very counterintuitive. The fact that holding W doesn't make you go forwards faster is extremely unintuitive for players who aren't used to the source movement mechanics. So without tutorials, this alone creates a barrier for entry that most new players never overcome. You're relying entirely on community members to do all of your heavy lifting. In the case of these two games, the lack of hand-holding is by choice. It's a creative decision that the developers made because they thought it improved the experience. And quite frankly, it does improve the experience. But in Jump and Surf, they barely even have the option to give you comprehensive tutorials. Although there are people out there trying to change this. Momentum Mod is a standalone game being worked on by dozens of community members from all sorts of movement game modes. Surfing and bee-hopping and rocket jumping and sticky jumping, even some of the super old school things like conch jumping, they're all in there. And the goal for Momentum Mod is to have comprehensive tutorials for all skill levels in all of the game modes, so that any new player who finds their way into the community can have a fair shot at learning without having to ask the pros for help directly. Momentum Mod isn't actually out yet though, so for now, this massive barrier to entry is here to stay. But right now, you might be thinking to yourself, well surely all of this just means that the game is bad, right? Surely if the game doesn't tell you anything and alienates newer or less dedicated players, then the game just needs to be fixed by the devs to be kinder to these new players. Well, no. Because when it comes to games like this, the barrier to entry and the lack of tutorialization is all part of the fun. Part of the charm of the game is having to figure it out for yourself. And in my mind, there is one game that exemplifies this design philosophy better than any other game possibly could. And that is Rainworld. Rainworld is a game that has one of the harshest new player experiences that I've ever come across, and it's better off for it. Because Rainworld has a story, and it has a beginning and an end, and it has cool mechanics, and it has enemy AI that makes AAA titles blush. It has all of this stuff going for it, but on your first playthrough, you'd be hard-pressed to know that any of this stuff even existed before the halfway mark. The game disguises itself as a survival game, where your only goal is to find food and find shelter to survive. But in reality, the game is much more like a Metroidvania, where you're exploring the non-linear map at your own pace to eventually reach the end of the game, wherever that end of the game may be. It's not obvious that there would be any story. It's not obvious that there would be any objective at all. It's not even obvious that there's more than one region in the entire game until you first stumble upon a gate that lets you leave the outskirts. But this is all part of the charm, because Rainworld is all about discovery. The game is like an ecosystem, where there's dozens of different creatures that are all part of the food chain, and you just happen to be in the middle of it. And your character being a young and inexperienced little slug cat guy means that you need to learn how to survive. And what better way to evoke that feeling in a player than to, you know, make them learn how to survive. Learn how certain enemies hunt, learn how to fight them, and learn things about your environment. If the game just explicitly told you all this stuff, it would make the experience significantly less exciting or meaningful. Take these guys for example. These guys are called Daddy Longlegs, and they're completely terrifying. Once their tentacle grabs you, you're very unlikely to be able to escape. But their weakness is their method of hunting, because the Daddy Longlegs is completely blind. They can only figure out where you are with audio. So a clever little slug cat can make a racket far away to lure the beast away from a certain area, then sneak away quietly to get past the monster unharmed. And the game hints at this. Whenever a sound loud enough for the creature to hear occurs, their cores twitch and light up. And this tiny animation is enough for attentive players to realize realise exactly what's happening. If the game just popped up some dialogue box on your screen that was all like, yo dude, they can't see, just throw a rock at this wall and run, it would ruin the entire experience. The learning process would be completely gone. And this sort of thing exists for pretty much everything in the entire game. These lizards go invisible to try and surprise attack you. These guys blend into ceilings and drop on their prey. The centipede's vision is based on movement, so if you stay still and don't touch them, they cannot see you. All of these revelations are pretty hard to make, but making these realizations on a first or second playthrough makes you feel like an absolute genius. This is part of what makes the game feel so fantastic, but the trade-off the developers are making here is very obvious. It means that a new player is completely overwhelmed, and the game feels entirely too punishing for their tastes. A new player doesn't know any of this stuff yet. They don't even know what they're supposed to be doing or where they're supposed to be going. And this open-ended sort of game is not for everyone. This barrier to entry makes the game feel crushing and unfair. But the barrier to entry is what makes the game so good. The charm of these games is their high skill ceiling and their decision to not hold your hand when they don't need to. But unfortunately, that means that the new player experience will suffer. And that is why these games will never be popular. Because when the game feels too harsh or confusing for new players, then the game's growth will be massively stunted. But in the case of these games, it's by design, because letting you learn for yourself is all part of the charm. And it doesn't matter how good your new player experience is, if you take away the charm, you've taken away why people love your game in the first place. Thanks for watching.